In the summer of 1894, Faulkner, Missouri sat low and warm along the slow bend of the river, its streets thick with the smell of cottonwood sap and coal smoke. At the far end of Alder Street, just before the dirt road met the water, stood a house that did not seem to belong entirely to the town. It was large for the time, its white clapboard walls washed clean every spring, its shutters painted the same soft green as the willow leaves that brushed against the porch rail. The sign above the front steps read, "Given's Home for Girls," the letters carved deep into oak, varnished to a gloss. Neighbors spoke with admiration of the place. They saw it as a refuge for the abandoned and the lost, where the firm but gentle hand of matron Eliza Given shaped wayward girls into proper young women. From the outside, it looked like the safest house in Faulkner. Eliza herself was a figure the town held in quiet regard. She dressed modestly, her dark skirts falling straight to her ankles, her blouses buttoned to the throat even in summer. Her hair was always pinned in a tight bun that never seemed to loosen, not even in the wind. People described her as patient, with a voice that was calm no matter the occasion. Children on the street would wave, and she would raise her hand in return, though rarely with a smile. What the town loved most was her consistency. The Givens home never turned away a girl, no matter her past. To the churchwomen and the shopkeepers, this was proof of Christian charity. To Eliza, it was something else entirely. The home itself breathed in a way that made visitors uneasy without understanding why. The hallways were long and straight, lined with framed prints of flowers and birds, each one hung at the same height. The floors were always swept, yet the air inside held a faint scent of boiled starch and something metallic beneath it. The sound of footsteps carried strangely, as if the boards beneath were hollow in certain places. The girls kept their voices low, especially upstairs where the dormitory windows overlooked the river. Eliza encouraged quiet, saying it brought peace to the mind, but her eyes would rest too long on the ones who failed to obey. From the front parlor, a visitor could see a single locked cabinet against the far wall. It was painted the same green as the shutters outside, blending in so well it often escaped notice. Inside were the house records, or so Eliza said when anyone asked. No one in town had ever seen them, but no one felt the need to press. Her reputation was spotless. The ledger she brought to church fundraisers always showed neat handwriting, precise columns of names and dates of arrival, but never any note of departure. People assumed the girls left quietly, moving on to work in other towns or to live with distant family. The truth was never spoken aloud, not because it was hidden with care, but because it was hidden in plain sight. On warm evenings, townsfolk would pass by the Givens home and hear the sound of a piano from the upstairs sitting room. The tune was always slow, deliberate, as if the notes were being weighed before being allowed to fall. Eliza played with the same precision she applied to everything. No mistakes, no wasted motion. The girls listened in silence, their faces pale in the lamplight. Some clutched their hands in their laps as if holding themselves together. Others stared at the floor. The neighbors found it charming, proof that Eliza valued culture and discipline. They did not see the way the music stopped abruptly some nights, followed by a stillness that felt too deep, as if the house itself were listening for something to end. By midsummer, the river air grew heavy and the boards of the house seemed to swell with the damp. That was when the whispers began among the older children in town. Stories about girls who went into the Givens home and were never seen again. The adults dismissed it as a childish invention, the sort of rumor that rises wherever orphans are kept. Yet the number of faces at the upstairs windows seemed fewer each year. When asked, Eliza would say the girls had been placed elsewhere, given better opportunities. Her voice carried the kind of certainty that discouraged further questions. What no one knew, not even the church elders who visited on holidays, was that the house was already keeping account of its own. Beneath the rugs, under the careful polish of the dormitory floor, faint marks had begun to appear. They were not scratches from wear or careless feet. They were letters, carved into the grain of the wood, so shallow they could be missed unless the light hit them just right. Eliza would kneel after the girls were asleep, her hand steady, the carving tool gliding through the oak with the patience of someone who had done this before. One name per board, each followed by the year. To her it was not a record but a seal, a way to keep what she believed belonged to the house from slipping away. The people of Faulkner would have sworn they knew every good thing about Eliza Givens. They knew nothing of the count she was keeping, nor of the reason each floorboard in that quiet house seemed heavier than it should have been. The river ran slow and dark past Alder Street, carrying away whatever the town was not ready to face. Inside the Givens home, the count had only just begun. The carpenter remembered it as one of the strangest commissions of his life. Eliza Givens had approached him in the spring of that year, her manner calm but exacting, as if she had already measured the room in her mind and knew precisely what she wanted. She asked for the upstairs dormitory to be refloored with oak. Not common oak, but boards from a particular mill upriver, cut thick and left untreated on the underside. She spoke in detail about how each plank should run unbroken from wall to wall without seams, and how the boards must be fitted so tightly that no light could pass between them. She paid, more than his usual rate, in cash, and asked that no apprentices assist him. He did as she asked. At the time, he thought she simply valued good craftsmanship. Only later would he wonder if she had been building something meant to hold more than footsteps. The dormitory smelled sharp and green when the job was done, the raw oak still breathing out the scent of the trees it had come from. The boards shone under the lamplight, each one smooth and level, the grain running like slow water. Eliza stood in the doorway, her hands folded, and told the carpenter it was exactly as she had pictured. She lingered as he packed his tools, her eyes resting on the floor with a quiet satisfaction, as if the work were not an addition but the completion of something long planned. She saw him out without further word, and the sound of the door closing behind him was the last he would hear from her for months. Weeks later, when he returned on an errand to repair the porch railing, he noticed a small, deliberate carving near the center of the dormitory floor. The letters were shallow but clean. SARAH 1894. The size of the letters was such that they could vanish under the shadow of a bedpost, yet they were positioned where they would be stepped over daily. Eliza explained it away without being asked, telling him in passing that Sarah had been a dear girl sent to live with distant kin, and that the carving was her way of keeping the memory close. The carpenter nodded politely, though the words left an odd chill in him. There had been no send-off, No wagon packed for travel, no letter from the receiving family. In town, people accepted the explanation without question. It was not unusual for orphans to be placed in other homes with little notice, and Eliza's word carried the weight of trust. The name on the floor was spoken of kindly, as a touching gesture from a matron who cared enough to keep the memory of her charges alive. The truth, though, lay heavy in the attic above, where Sarah's trunk sat under a thin veil of dust, its brass latch closed but not locked. Inside, her dresses hung limp, her shoes still paired neatly, her small wooden hairbrush resting on top. No one ever asked why these things had not gone with her, and Eliza never offered an answer. At night, when the house was still, Eliza would kneel on the new oak boards with the carving knife in her hand. She worked slowly, her wrists steady, her breath measured. The act was not mere remembrance, but a sealing. The name pressed into the grain as if it could anchor something unseen beneath. She believed the oak would hold what the flesh could not, that the boards could drink in the last traces of a life if prepared correctly. Sarah's name was the first to mark that belief, the beginning of a record she intended to keep for as long as the house stood. She would run her fingertips over the letters when no one was looking, not in grief, but in quiet possession, as if confirming that nothing had been lost. The carpenter would think of that floor in the years to come, the way the boards seemed to hum faintly when walked upon, the way the air in that room never quite matched the rest of the house. And though he could not explain why, he would find himself avoiding the center of the room, stepping around it as though the name there was not simply written but waiting. The first name had been carved and the wood had begun to learn its purpose. By autumn, the Givens home had taken on a rhythm that seemed ordinary to outsiders but was unlike any household in Faulkner. Eliza's rules were not written anywhere, yet they were obeyed without hesitation. The first was simple: no shoes after sundown. At the evening bell, the girls were to remove them and place them in neat rows against the wall. Eliza said it kept the floors clean and preserved the wood, but there was another reason, one the girls understood instinctively. Without shoes, footsteps were softer, and in the silence of the upper floor, softer footsteps made it harder to know who was moving where. The second rule was stranger: no speaking in the upstairs hallway. If a girl had something to say, she had to step inside a room and close the door before she spoke. Eliza told visitors this was to keep the noise from disturbing the sick or the sleeping. To the girls, it was an unspoken warning. Words spoken in that hallway carried further than they should, and sometimes they were heard by someone who was not there. Each night before bed, every girl was weighed on the large iron scale in the pantry. This was the third rule, and it was enforced with exact precision. The matron would record the number in her small black book, her pen scratching steadily across the page. If a girl's weight dropped by more than a pound, Eliza would assign her to rest for the following day, forbidding chores and meals beyond a small bowl of broth. No one could understand why losing weight would mean being given less to eat. Eliza told them it was for their health, that the body needed time to recover from sudden change. Yet the look in her eyes as she read the numbers suggested something else. A quiet satisfaction, as though she was watching a process unfold exactly as it should. Those who broke the rules were sent to the rest chamber. From the outside, it was only a small room at the end of the hall, its door the same green as the others. Inside, the walls were lined with heavy quilt batting from floor to ceiling. The air was close and heavy, and the single light was a dim bulb protected by a wire cage. There was no bed, only a narrow bench. Eliza claimed the room was for calm reflection, a place where a girl could compose herself without distraction. But those who spent a night there returned pale and slow to speak, as if something in the stillness had pressed on their thoughts until they no longer fit inside their heads the same way. The girls learned to obey, and in time the rules became habits. Visitors often remarked on the quiet discipline of the Givens home, saying it was rare to see such order in a house of children. They did not see the small signs, the way the girls flinched when Eliza's footsteps sounded behind them, the way some pressed their toes against the floorboards as if trying to feel something beneath. The house had its own order, its own kind of balance, and Eliza guarded it with a devotion that went beyond care. To her, the rules were not merely for the girls' behavior. They were for the house itself, to keep it ready for what she believed it was meant to hold. The oak floor upstairs had been walked on for months now, and Eliza had grown familiar with its sounds. She knew which boards gave the faintest creak, which carried the vibrations of a footstep further than the others. She listened to these changes the way a physician might listen to a patient's breath, attentive to the smallest shift. At night, after the weighing and the quiet march to bed, she would walk the hallway in her stockings, pausing at certain spots, her eyes on the names she had already carved and the empty boards waiting for more. The rules ensured the house stayed still enough for her to hear the difference between a floor simply holding weight and a floor remembering it. The difference to Eliza was everything. When the fever came through Faulkner that winter, the church sent a nurse to help tend the sick girls at the Givens home. Margaret Evans was not from the town. She was a plain, serious woman in her 30s who had seen enough disease to know when an illness was natural and when it was not. The moment she stepped into the dormitory, she noticed how still the air felt, as if the walls had learned to hold their breath. The girls lay in their beds, eyes open but unfocused, their lips dry. Some coughed weakly, but it was not the fever that unsettled her most. It was the way they stared at the floor as if they were listening to something only they could hear. Margaret worked beside Eliza for several days, helping with the weighing each night. She watched how the matron handled the iron scale, how carefully she recorded each number in a small black ledger she kept close at all times. The book never left Eliza's side. When Margaret caught sight of its pages by accident, she saw not only names and weights, but dates and precise times written in the same measured hand. Some entries ended abruptly, the ink trailing off after a number, leaving a space where the next weight should have been. In the margins were strange notations, a single circle, a pair of short lines, or an arrow pointing downward. Margaret recognized the downward arrow as the mark Eliza made when a girl had lost weight. But the meaning of the other symbols remained hidden. It did not take long for Margaret to notice a pattern. Certain girls lost several pounds over the course of just a few days, even though they were eating the same as the others. They grew pale, their movements slowing, their breathing shallow. And then, without warning, they were gone. Eliza would tell Margaret that they had been sent to a convalescent home outside town to recover, but no wagon ever came and no letters ever followed. Their beds were stripped, their names marked in the ledger with a final time and date. Margaret asked once if she might send word to the girls' families, but Eliza's answer was so calm and certain that it closed the conversation entirely. She said there were no families to write to, and it was better that way. One evening, while Eliza was downstairs, Margaret took the risk of lifting the ledger from its place beside the scale. She turned to the earliest pages and saw the first name, Sarah, 1894, with a series of numbers beneath. The weight dropped over 3 days, then stopped. Below it was a small circle drawn in the same ink and nothing more. Every name that followed ended the same way. The weight falling, the final mark, and then silence. The further she read, the more she felt as if the ledger were not a record of health, but of something being taken. Margaret returned the book before Eliza came back, her hands cold. She began to watch the matron more closely after that, noting the way she lingered in the dormitory long after the girls had been put to bed, her gaze fixed not on the sleepers but on the boards beneath them. It was as if Eliza was listening for a sound Margaret could not hear, counting something Margaret could not name. The nurse could not yet understand the meaning of the downward arrow, or the circles, or the empty space after each name. But she knew the ledger was not a tool of care. It was a record of endings, and in the stillness of the Givens home, more endings were coming. It began with a repair. Late in the summer of 1896, a violent storm rolled down the river, tearing shingles from rooftops and leaving branches scattered in the streets. The Givens home lost part of its dormitory roof, and a local worker named Henry Dobbins was sent to fix it. He arrived early in the morning, the sky still heavy with damp air, and climbed the narrow stairs to the upper floor. As he crossed the dormitory to inspect the damage, his boot heel struck the oak boards in the center of the room, and a hollow sound rose from beneath. A deep, unnatural echo, as if the floor was covering an empty space far larger than the crawl space of an ordinary house. Henry paused and tapped the board again. The sound was different from the rest, softer and lower, almost muffled. He was about to kneel and check the nails when Eliza appeared in the doorway. She told him there was no need to disturb the flooring, that the noise was only the settling of the joists in the damp weather. Her voice was calm, but her eyes did not leave his boots. Henry nodded and moved on, yet the sound lingered in his mind, as if it had been less a noise and more a warning. That night, a girl named Molly was missing from the supper table. The others ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their plates. Margaret, now accustomed to the sudden disappearances, asked quietly where she had gone. Eliza told her Molly had been moved to a better home upriver, the same explanation she always gave. There was no trunk packed, no clothing removed from the small dresser beside her bed. But the following morning a new carving appeared in the oak. Molly, 1896. The letters were still pale in the wood, their edges unsoftened by polish. Margaret began to listen for the hollow sound in the nights that followed. It came only when the room was still, a faint resonance under certain steps, as though the floor was remembering something recently placed beneath it. The sound was not constant. It would vanish for days, only to return without warning, stronger than before. She noticed it most after the weighing. When Eliza walked alone in the dormitory, her stockings whispering over the boards. The matron would stop in certain places, tilt her head as if catching a distant tone, and then move on with a measured step. For the girls, the sound became a private omen. They never spoke of it aloud, but their behavior changed when it returned. The lightest sleepers would refuse to close their eyes, staring instead at the shadowed ceiling. Others clutched their blankets tight, pulling their feet away from the floor as if afraid the boards might open. When the sound came, they all knew that one of them would be gone before the week was over. Henry Dobbins never returned to finish the repairs. He claimed he was needed for urgent work on the river barges, but in truth he could not shake the memory of the echo beneath his feet. In town, he told no one what he had heard, though years later he would admit to avoiding Alder Street altogether. Whatever space lay beneath those boards was not for the living, and the house seemed to know when someone had heard it. In the Givens home, the hollow sound was not a flaw in the construction. It was part of the design. Margaret found it by accident. She had gone to the pantry one evening to fetch linens for the sick room when her hand brushed against a low panel near the floor. It was cut differently from the rest, its edges faintly beveled as if meant to be opened. She knelt, tugged, and felt it give way with a slow groan of old hinges. Behind it, the dark mouth of a narrow hatch yawned open, exhaling a stale, sweet odor that made her stomach turn. She hesitated only a moment before lowering herself inside, the wood cool beneath her palms as she descended the short ladder into the space below. The chamber was small and close, the ceiling low enough that she had to stoop. The air was heavy, almost syrup-thick, as if it had been breathed too many times and never refreshed. The walls were lined with long, narrow wooden slots, each the exact length of a child's body. At one end of each slot, a carved headrest cradled the skull at a fixed, angle-heavy iron clamps padded with worn cloth were bolted to the sides, positioned to hold a head perfectly still. Margaret touched one and felt the faint imprint of hair pressed into the fabric. She could not tell if the marks were old or recent. A strange mechanism was fixed along the wall. Thin pipes ran from the head of each slot upward into the ceiling, disappearing into the structure above. Following them with her eyes, she saw they aligned perfectly with the vents in the dormitory floor. The arrangement was too deliberate to be coincidence. By the ladder, a large bellows sat on the ground, its handles worn smooth. She understood then. The chamber was connected to the upstairs vents, not to bring air in, but to take it away. Slowly, carefully, so the body would not fight until it was too weak to resist. The oak boards above her head seemed thicker here, their undersides raw and unvarnished. Margaret thought of the carvings she had seen in the dormitory, the names pressed into the grain. She imagined the last breath of a girl rising through the vents, being pulled into these boards, soaking into the wood until nothing of her was left but the name etched above. The chamber was not only a place to take life, it was part of a ritual to keep it. She backed toward the ladder, her chest tight, but before she climbed out she noticed something else. Along the far wall, half hidden by shadow, a row of shallow drawers sat flush with the boards. She opened one and found a small linen bundle neatly folded containing a pair of shoes and a ribbon of pale blue hair tied in a loop. The next drawer held the same. Personal things, intimate things, all arranged with care. There was nothing of violence in their placement, only a disturbing reverence, as though each item were an offering. Margaret replaced everything as she had found it and climbed out, closing the hatch quietly behind her. In the stillness of the pantry, she listened. The house above was silent, the air unmoving. But she knew now that the silence was not peace. It was the pause between one breath and the last. A stillness the Givens home had been built to collect. And somewhere upstairs, Eliza Givens was waiting for the next name. In the weeks after discovering the chamber, Margaret began to notice things she had overlooked before. On the nights when a girl vanished, Eliza would sit alone in her upstairs study long after the lamps in the dormitory had gone dark. A single candle burned beside her, casting light over a wide writing desk cluttered not with ledgers of household accounts but with loose pages filled edge to edge in her sharp, unwavering hand. The writing was not idle record-keeping. It was a set of instructions, diagrams, and observations written with the focus of someone who believed she was conducting important work. The papers described something Eliza called transference, the idea that the final breath of a pure soul could be taken into an object and held there indefinitely, preserved as a form of protective force. Margaret pieced together fragments from the scattered pages when she could steal moments in the study. Eliza believed the oak itself was the perfect vessel for holding this captured breath. Not because it was durable, but because its grain was porous enough to drink deeply. She wrote that the breath of the innocent, when drawn at the moment between life and death, was clean of all ill, and that once sealed into the oak it could guard against sickness, misfortune, and moral decay. The home, she claimed, would never fail so long as the boards were fed. This was why each name was carved into the floor, not as a memorial, but as a seal to mark the place where the last breath had entered the wood. There were notes on method as well, clinical in their precision. The breath chamber, she wrote, was to be used only when the subject had grown quiet and weak, so the passage would be without chaos. The bellows were not to be worked too quickly. Too much force might scatter the breath instead of drawing it whole. When the air had been taken, the board above must be carved within the same hour before the breath could wander. The knife strokes had to be clean, never hurried, the letters spaced exactly the same in every name. Eliza recorded the weight of each girl before and after, noting the change down to the smallest fraction of a pound. What unsettled Margaret most was the tone of these writings. There was no cruelty in the words, no gloating. They read like the pages of a healer's journal, careful and detached, as though Eliza saw herself not as a killer but as a custodian preserving something precious. She wrote of the girls as vessels too small to contain what is needed, as though their deaths were a necessary release rather than an act of harm. The calmness of her belief was what made it monstrous. She was not hiding from her own conscience. She believed she was saving the home. Margaret began to understand that Eliza's methods were not born from sudden madness, but from years of deliberate thought. Every rule, every weighing, every moment of silence in the hallways was part of a controlled environment, a way to keep the house ready for the next transfer. Even the careful selection of oak from a single mill upriver was part of the design. The Givens home was not just a place where Eliza lived. It was the instrument of her work, and the girls were the raw material it required. At night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Margaret could hear the faint creak of the boards as Eliza moved through the dormitory. She would pause in certain places, and in that pause, Margaret could almost hear the matron's mind at work. Not with guilt, but with the measured satisfaction of someone tending to a living thing. The house had been fed for years now, and Eliza intended to keep feeding it for as long as the wood could take another breath. The winter of 1897 was the cruelest the town had seen in years. The river froze at the edges, wagons broke down on the ice-slick roads, and families without coal burned furniture to keep from freezing. The county officials, desperate to relieve the burden on the smaller homesteads, began placing children wherever there was space. The Givens home, with its spotless ledgers and long reputation for order, was given 13 new girls in a single week. They arrived thin, frostbitten, and silent, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. Eliza accepted them with the same calm courtesy she offered to every arrival, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders as she led them into the dormitory. She assured the officials the home could bear the weight. In truth, she welcomed it. The dormitory filled to a suffocating quiet that winter. Beds lined the walls, their frames so close together the girls could have reached out and touched each other, though none did. The air in the room felt heavier with each passing week, and the sound of breathing at night rose and fell like the tide. Margaret noticed the weighing became more frequent. Sometimes twice a day, always followed by long sessions in the study where Eliza recorded numbers with a steady hand. She had begun keeping 2 ledgers now, one in plain view for visitors, the other locked away in the cabinet painted the same green as the shutters. The private ledger grew thick with names in quick succession. By February, the carvings on the floor began to multiply. Each morning seemed to bring a new one, the letters pale and raw before the oil was rubbed into them. Sarah, Molly, Anna, Rose. Within 2 months, 8 names had been added. The wood marked so often the dormitory floor looked less like a surface for walking and more like a vast unrolling list. The girls still living in the room began to move differently, stepping around the names as though the boards beneath them were fragile glass. Margaret saw how they glanced at the empty stretches of oak, calculating the distance between one name and the next, wondering when the space would run out. The silence in the dormitory deepened. It was no longer the quiet of obedience, but of resignation. The younger ones cried less at night. The older ones stopped speaking altogether, their eyes fixed on the floor during meals. Even the sound of play in the yard vanished, replaced by the slow shuffle of chores done without urgency. The house had learned their weight, their steps, their breathing. It seemed to Margaret that the walls were drawing inward, each room bending slightly toward the dormitory, as though the entire structure was leaning into the place where the oak drank most deeply. Eliza moved among them like a caretaker tending a fragile crop. Her hand rested lightly on a thin shoulder here. Her gaze lingered on a downturned face there. She spoke gently, but her attention was never idle, always weighing, always listening for the faint hollow tone beneath a certain board. The ledger filled faster than Margaret could bear to think about. each new entry marked with the same small circle in the margin. The space between those circles was shrinking. By early spring, the floor had taken so many names that Margaret could no longer look at it without feeling as if she were staring at a graveyard. Yet no bodies were ever found, and no wagons ever came to take the girls away. The names were all that remained, carved in patient strokes, sealing the air below. The dormitory, once a place for sleep, had become the beating heart of the Givens home, a heart that demanded to be fed, and that winter, Eliza had given it more than it had ever known. The first time Margaret saw her own name, it was faint, no more than the shallow outline of letters cut into the farthest corner of the dormitory floor. She had been changing the linens when the light from the window fell across the grain just so, revealing the curve of an M, the slant of an A. Her hands froze, clutching the sheet, as her eyes traced the unfinished carving. The first 4 letters were there, sharp and clean, and then the cuts stopped mid-stroke. The space for the rest of her name lay waiting. She did not need the rest to understand. The ledger's silent pattern had finally reached her. From that moment, every sound in the house became sharper, more dangerous. The creak of the stairs, the soft whisper of Eliza's stockings in the hallway, the slow turning of the ledger's pages, all of it felt like the ticking of a clock that was now counting her time. At night she lay awake, certain she could hear the faint pulse of the hollow space beneath the floor. She thought of the breath chamber, the narrow slots, the iron clamps waiting in the shadows. She imagined her final breath drawn away, her name pressed into the oak before her body cooled. The image lodged in her mind like a splinter. Margaret began planning her escape in silence, careful not to change her routines. She continued weighing the girls each night, writing down the numbers for Eliza as if nothing had shifted. But she stopped lingering upstairs after the lamps were put out, retreating to her room early to listen for the matron's footsteps. When she moved through the house, she kept to the edges of the hall, her feet skimming lightly over the boards to avoid the hollow spots. She stole small things she would need: a length of twine, a folded scrap of bread, matches tucked inside her apron pocket. She hid them beneath the loose floorboard in her quarters, one of the few boards she trusted. The night she chose was cold and windless. She waited until the dormitory was silent, until Eliza's measured tread passed down the hall and faded into the study. She moved quickly, her heart pounding with the certainty that if she hesitated, the house itself would alert the matron. Down the stairs, past the dark parlor, through the pantry where the hatch to the breath chamber lay closed like a sleeping mouth. She did not look at it. Her hand found the back door latch, and for a moment she feared it would groan in the frame, but it opened without sound. The air outside was sharp, the stars cold pinpricks against the black. She slipped into the alley behind the house, her steps quickening as she crossed into the narrow back lanes of Faulkner. The lights of the Givens home glowed faintly behind her, the green shutters closed tight. She did not turn to look again until she had reached the edge of town, her breath burning in her chest. Only then did she see the house from a distance, standing still against the dark, its shape too calm, too composed, as if her leaving had been expected. In her hand she carried a sealed envelope she had taken from her room, her account of the breath chamber, the ledger, the names carved into the floor. It was addressed to the sheriff, She did not know if it would be enough. Margaret kept walking, the road unfolding before her in the thin moonlight. Behind her, in that shuttered house on Alder Street, the floor waited with her name half etched into its grain. The knife set aside, the work paused, but not ended. It was 2 days after Margaret reached the sheriff's office that the raid on the Givens home began. Faulkner's lawmen were not used to such work. They arrived in the early light, boots crunching over frost, their rifles slung but ready, their faces tight with a kind of nervous resolve. The townspeople gathered at a distance, murmuring among themselves, unsure what to believe. Most still thought of Eliza as a figure of grace, the woman who had taken in more girls than anyone else in the county. But curiosity drew them like flies to sugar, and they watched as the men climbed the steps and hammered on the painted door. Eliza answered herself, calm as ever, her hair pinned tight, her dark dress immaculate. She did not resist, nor did she ask why they had come. Instead, she stepped aside and allowed them in, her voice low and steady as she said they were welcome to search. The officers moved through the rooms quickly, expecting to find frightened children hidden away. But there were no children. The dormitory stood empty, beds neatly made, blankets folded with exact precision. Dust motes drifted in the still air, catching the pale morning light. It was only when one of the men pulled up the edge of a rug that they saw it, name after name carved into the oak, the dates stretching back years. The boards were smooth underfoot, but to the touch the grooves were sharp and deep, the letters clean as the day they had been cut. Some names were so old the grain had warped around them, the wood swollen and darkened as if something had burned its way outward from beneath. One officer knelt to press his palm against a board and recoiled almost immediately, claiming it was warmer than the rest of the floor. The men searched the house from top to bottom. They opened the pantry hatch and found the breath chamber just as Margaret had described. The narrow slots, the iron clamps, the bellows, the strange network of pipes leading upward. But there were no bodies, no bones, only a faint sweet scent in the air clinging to the wood as if it had seeped into it. In the attic they found trunks filled with clothing, shoes, and small personal trinkets, enough for dozens of girls. Yet the rooms themselves remained empty, as if the children had been erased, not removed. Eliza followed them from room to room without protest, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. When asked where the girls had gone, she said only that they had been placed where they belonged. She offered no names, no locations. Her expression never changed, even when confronted with the carvings. She simply remarked that it was good to remember the dead. To the lawmen, it was not enough to hold her for murder. There was no proof of death, only proof of something they could not name. Still, they took her into custody on suspicion of unlawful confinement, though even that charge felt too small for what they had seen. By the time they let her out the front door, the townsfolk were silent. No one shouted, no one spat. They watched her pass with a kind of stunned quiet, as if they too felt the weight of the names carved into the wood, the strange emptiness of the house that had been so full only weeks before. Behind them, the Givens home stood still in the pale sun, the dormitory floor hidden once more beneath its rugs, the air inside unmoving, the hollow beneath the boards untouched. Whatever had been taken from that place was gone, and whatever had been left behind was not something the law could carry out in chains. The trial began in early spring, but the air in the courthouse was as heavy and still as the upper floor of the Givens home. People from across the county came to watch, packing the benches until the wood groaned under their weight. They expected outrage, confession, some flash of the hysteria whispered about in the taverns and church pews. Instead, Eliza Givens sat in her high-backed chair as she always had in her parlor, spine straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes calm. She did not fidget, did not lower her gaze. When the charges were read, unlawful confinement, neglect, and the suspected disappearance of multiple wards, she inclined her head slightly as though listening to an account of some long-past event that no longer concerned her. The prosecution laid out the evidence in steady order. They spoke of the missing girls, the names carved into the oak floor, the hidden chamber beneath the pantry. Margaret testified, her voice low but unwavering, describing the bellows, the narrow slots, the iron clamps padded with worn cloth. She spoke of the ledger, the weights recorded in a steady decline, the final marks beside each name. Some in the audience wept openly at her words. Others stared straight ahead, their faces pale with something colder than grief. Eliza listened without interruption. When it was her turn to speak, she did not deny a single thing. She admitted to keeping the ledger, to carving the names, to confining girls in the chamber. But she never called them prisoners. In her telling, the chamber was a place of purity, the oak a vessel for keeping them safe. She said the air taken from the girls was not lost but preserved, bound into the boards, so it could shield the home from the sicknesses of the world. Her voice was soft, almost maternal, and each word carried the conviction of someone who had repeated the explanation so many times in her own mind that it had become truth. Witnesses from Faulkner came forward to speak in her defense. They recalled the girls she had nursed through fevers, the order she kept in the home, the meals she served without complaint. They insisted that no one had ever seen her raise a hand in anger, that she had devoted her life to giving the unwanted a roof and a future. But their words rang hollow against the fact that none of the children who entered her care had written home. None had been seen again once they were placed elsewhere. Without bodies, the court could not convict her of murder. The law demanded proof, and all they had were names carved in wood and a silence that seemed to cling to the very grain of the boards. The jury found her guilty of lesser charges, enough to sentence her to confinement of her own. As the verdict was read, she showed no change in expression, no sign of fear or defeat. She looked at the judge with the same measured gaze she had given the girls in the dormitory, as though already weighing and recording something only she could see. When the trial ended, Eliza was led away in irons, her steps slow, deliberate, each one pressing into the courthouse floor like she was marking it for future remembrance. The people who had crowded the benches filed out in silence, each carrying the same unsettled thought, that she did not seem caught, only relocated. And somewhere in the abandoned dormitory on Alder Street, the floor waited, its names unchanging, its hollow still and patient. The county commissioners decided the Givens home would not stand. Too many in Faulkner avoided Alder Street now, crossing to the other side or taking longer routes through town just to keep from passing its green shutters. The building was scheduled for demolition that summer, and the work began with the upper floor. Men with crowbars and hammers moved through the dormitory, rolling back rugs stiff with dust. They paused at the sight of the names, dozens of them pale and clean against the dark boards, each one carved with such care it looked as though it had been done yesterday. The first plank lifted came up with difficulty, the nails refusing to yield. When it finally split free, the men stood back in silence. The underside of the board was blackened, not by fire, from without, but as if something had burned slowly inside the wood. The charring outlined the carved name perfectly, each letter seared into permanence. The same was true of the next board, and the next. The wood beneath every name darkened in the same strange, precise way. As more planks were lifted, the air in the room changed. A faint, sweet smell rose from the hollow beneath, growing stronger as the floor opened until it became thick enough to taste. Some men coughed, others turned away, pressing handkerchiefs to their faces, but none could name the scent. It was not rot, not smoke. It was something warm, almost pleasant, and all the more unbearable for it. Beneath the floor lay the breath chamber, just as Margaret had described. But now it was bare, stripped of anything living or dead. The narrow slots yawned open in the dim light, their clamps rusting, the bellows slack with disuse. Yet the heat rising from the boards persisted, radiating from the charred undersides as though the wood still held something it refused to release. The demolition foreman ordered the boards taken out in one piece, not for salvage but for burning. He wanted them destroyed before anyone could think to keep a peace. The boards were carried outside and stacked in the yard. When the fire was lit, the names glowed faintly in the smoke, the letters holding shape longer than the rest of the wood. Onlookers swore they heard faint sounds as the boards cracked in the flames. Not voices, not exactly, but something that moved like breath through a narrow space. By the time the fire burned down to ash, the smell had vanished and the air felt lighter, as though a weight had finally lifted from the yard. The house was taken apart piece by piece, the green shutters pried off, the clapboard walls pulled down until nothing remained but the brick chimney standing alone. The ground where the dormitory had been was leveled, but for days afterward people who walked near the site claimed the air tasted faintly sweet, and in the still hours before dawn they thought they heard a soft, hollow echo beneath their feet. Whether it was memory or something the fire had failed to consume, no one could say. In the months after the Givens home was reduced to rubble, Faulkner began a quiet erasure. The county clerk's office removed the orphanage's name from its public records. The church burned its old rosters of children once placed there. Families who had sent daughters to Alder Street were told again that the girls had moved on, married or died of fever in other towns. The explanations were tidy, final, and unchallenged. It was easier for the living to believe the lie than to face the truth that there had been no rescue, no departure. Only the floor, the lot where the home had stood, was left empty for years, the grass growing in patchy tufts over soil still darkened by the burn. The children of the town avoided it without being told to, crossing the street or circling around to the far path by the river. Older residents swore the air there still carried a faint sweetness in summer, and they would not linger. The sheriff's office kept Margaret's statement in a sealed envelope, filed in a drawer with no label. It was never entered into evidence, never made part of any public record. To speak of it would be to make it real, and Faulkner preferred its silence intact. Margaret herself left the county soon after the trial, moving east to work in a city hospital. For decades she kept her head down, her name out of newspapers, but in her final years she began to write. The pages were plain without flourish, but in them she described the house, the hollow beneath the floor, and the names carved into the oak. She insisted that the carvings were not mere memory but bindings, that the wood itself held what had been taken, and that anyone who touched those boards would feel a pulse beneath their fingers. She sent the manuscript to a small press, but it was never printed. It remained in a box of her belongings after her death, the pages smelling faintly of smoke. The site was eventually turned into a memorial garden, though its plaques mentioned no breath chamber, no ledger, no missing girls. The inscription spoke of charity and resilience, as if the town had endured some nameless hardship together rather than turned away from what happened in that green-shuttered house. Tourists visited without knowing the truth, and locals stayed away after dark. The silence held, not just the silence of the dead, but the silence of the living who had chosen not to remember. And yet the story did not vanish entirely. Now and then someone new to Faulkner would hear a name in passing, a name not found in any census, and find themselves asking why the grass in the memorial garden grew uneven, as if something beneath still shifted with the seasons. Those who had been in town long enough would answer only with a change of subject. In Faulkner, memory was not a thing spoken aloud. It was something kept underfoot where it could not be seen, but could still be felt by anyone who lingered too long. Today, the memorial garden on Alder Street is bright with flowers and benches, a place where visitors take photographs without ever knowing they are standing where the dormitory once stood. The oak trees planted along the edges are young, their roots shallow, but some swear the soil is warmer there than anywhere else in town. The plaques tell a careful story, one of community, of the town's resilience, of the many children who once called this place home. There is no mention of the names carved into the floor, no record of the hollow space beneath, no trace of the breath chamber. It is a history thinned to pleasantries, shaped to be palatable, safe. Eliza Givens died decades ago in a state hospital, her mind said to have faded into confusion in her final years. Yet the few who saw her near the end claimed, she still asked softly and without context, how many names there were now. No one answered. No one wanted to. Her death certificate gave her no title, no occupation, only her name, plain on the page. But for those who remembered the oak floor, her name was not plain at all. It was the first name carved there, invisibly before all the others. In Faulkner, the story of the Givens home remains a private inheritance, passed not in words but in glances, in the way older residents will turn their heads when children play too close to the memorial garden. There are those who insist the danger died with the house, that the wood was burned and the air beneath it released. But others believe the act of taking and binding a final breath is not tied to a single set of boards. They say it is a practice that can move, that any place could be prepared to hold what the Givens home once held, so long as the keeper believes enough to tend it. The truth is that evil like Eliza's does not announce itself. It is quiet, patient, draped in the language of care. It thrives in the spaces where people do not want to look too closely, where the comfort of believing in goodness outweighs the unease of asking for proof. In her time, Eliza wore the mask of a savior, and Faulkner was content to let her. Every community, no matter how modern or watchful, still has its masks, and still prefers them unremoved. So the question lingers like the faint sweetness that once clung to the boards. Could it happen again? Could someone somewhere be keeping a private count behind closed doors, preparing a place to hold what should never be taken? The answer is not in Faulkner's records nor in any courtroom transcript. It lies in the quiet houses we pass each day without suspicion, in the people whose calm hides the careful work of something we cannot see until it is too late. And if it is happening now, it will not be in a place we expect, nor by the hands we fear. It will be where we feel safest and where no one dares to listen for the hollow sound beneath their feet.